you start thinking about like, oh, what can I bolt on top of that? Can I add my radius server? Can I add a wireless access point that's virtualized? And you start to see all of this opportunity to bolt on different portable bits of technology into one form factor. And that was really kind of the dream for all of this. It's like, hey, we already have this box that's virtualizing all of these workloads. What if we actually had this operating as a Helium node or as an Arcium node or as an inference node? And that way we can earn additional rewards just for deploying this router, which we need to deploy anyway. Solana is just the home for DePIN. The early release that we've had for the black box has been so strong in large part thanks to the Solana ecosystem. In my mind, it just reinforces that we made the right decision because that's just where all of the great DePIN community is.
Well, Neil, welcome back to the Proof of Coverage podcast. You've been on here a few times now, but I saw you recently take a trip to Washington, D.C. I'm seeing more and more DePIN founders head up there, which I think is a good thing. So maybe tell us a bit about what that experience was like. Why'd you go and how did it change your perspective on building a DePIN project, network, company in America?
Yeah, Connor, thanks for having me on here, man. And so from Congress was actually a pretty awesome trip. And that was one that was organized by the Solana Policy Institute. And the idea was just to go like this is kind of an advance of the Genius Bill and all that kind of stuff passing, but it was an opportunity to go meet with a bunch of different congressmen and women across both sides of the aisle, just to be able to actually just talk to them about how DePIN it was an opportunity to talk to them about DePIN in the broader crypto landscape and how we think about it. And what I always thought was kind of a fascinating, takeaway that I had from that trip there, and I think we met with around 14 congressmen and women altogether. The biggest takeaway that I had was people realize the power that crypto has, and they know it's an inevitability. And that was what kind of got me really bullish about being able to build in the US and continuing to build in the US because it's just you can feel the regulatory environment beginning to warm up to it. And I always thought it was interesting how there's now a real like anti-crypto lobby. It's kind of more like up to us to make sure that we don't shoot ourselves in the foot. And of course, there's some inertia that comes from this as well that we have to overcome. But by and large, like everybody was just super receptive to it. And I think the example that I always use to explain to Congress about like why I think crypto is inevitable and valuable was I kept using the FEMA case. So like if you're in a scenario where a city is destroyed or a coastal city is destroyed by a hurricane, that's exactly when FEMA is supposed to step in, right? Government allocated funds that are supposed to be used to be able to help out with every bit of relief. But the one that we were able to talk about was specifically infrastructure. And, you can point to incredible use cases like, when with Helium, where they have the Starlink antenna being able to use to broadcast a signal further out. It's just such a serendipitous use case for DePIN and crypto that they realize that, hey, if FEMA funds do run out or we can't get the funds that we need for our districts, our states, like what are you going to do? And that's really where I think, the power of crypto incentives come in is that you can kind of incentivize the creation of these networks in areas where you desperately need them. So the FEMA example one was one that I think was tend to resonate quite a bit. And then the other thing they're always thinking about is like, to what extent can this create jobs? And I think it's like the example that we tend to use a little bit. I don't know if we use this example too much, but it's kind of like crypto allows you to create this like trustless gig economy. And if you put it with this DePIN flavor on top of it, it's this trustless gig economy for building meaningful infrastructure, right? And this country used to really care about infrastructure, right? This country used to be known for its prioritization of infrastructure. And if we can kind of use DePIN to bring that heart of infrastructure back to our country and create a bunch of jobs in the process, I think it's going to be like an incredible thing that people are going to be glad that DePIN is at the center of crypto in the coming years.
100%. Yeah, I'm glad to hear the reception was that warm. And what was their reaction to hearing about, Dawn and Andrina and what you guys are building specifically in terms of like, how much did you have to explain what an ISP is or what a wireless DePIN is? Like, what was the reaction to you guys specifically?
Dude, these guys are smart. You don't have to explain any of this stuff to them. They understand the idea of wireless. Now, of course, they understand it specifically from the realm of like what they've seen with Starlink and what they've seen with like LTE and 5G networks. But the idea that, hey, you can actually use wireless to provide broadband, like kind of similar to Starlink, but more just terrestrial. that one is one where once they kind of get it, these are all smart guys and girls, so they can kind of, draw the connections about, oh, if I have one person that has surplus connectivity, they can broadcast that signal out and how anybody can get signed up. And so I think, like, again, coming back to, like, the case of like resilient infrastructure, the idea that you can have, wireless infrastructure that can be dynamically spun up by users, and then it can form these new networks without having to dig trenches. Like, all of this stuff kind of resonates quite well with them as they kind of think about like what is going to be the future for infrastructure in this country.
Awesome. Yeah, good to hear that they're clued in on how the internet works. I remember when we first talked, you honestly taught me a lot about all the plumbing and going from undersea cables to data centers to antennas on top of roofs, and we'll get into that in a second. But first thing I want to ask, or next thing I want to ask is, I think you guys are kind of leading the DePIN sector in terms of high-end video marketing, in terms of like all the product and partner announcements have looked really good. Like you guys are clearly investing there. We've done some work together recently that I'm excited to share soon. But what motivated you to level things up like that in the first place instead of doing kind of the usual bland partner announcements? And maybe what do you see as the benefits to like crypto protocols or startups of really doing some high-end video marketing and putting time and effort into that?
Yeah, our objective with creating content was kind of a direct consequence of what our go to market is. And if I could say the go to market in simple terms is we're just trying to expand the market for crypto and make it more appealing to what people would typically call normies, but it's just people that are like have limited crypto experience. And I am kind of, put it as like my mission of like I want to bring DePIN to as many people as possible. And that means that you have to make it accessible, you have to make it familiar, you have to make it, something that ties into what they already know. And so I think when you kind of view the end consumer as somebody that's not just like a deeply, invested, person in crypto or on crypto Twitter, you view it as like an average household that can actually realize the benefit of deeping in crypto. That just it's a kind of like a logical consequence of that is like, of course, I want to make videos that can help get people excited, that can distill it down into simple things for people to understand, because there's so many cool ways to get involved in when, in the Dawn ecosystem, that we just want to make it as appealing to as many people as possible, just because, on a percentage basis, it has a huge impact if you can capture a few people, as long as you're appealing to a large enough audience. So yeah, I'd say it's just a direct consequence of our desire to expand the market and to put DePIN right at the center of that.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, target audience is kind of like every homeowner in America, right? Which is pretty broad, but also it's also a lot of people that have no idea, what crypto is or might not be that clued in. So that makes sense that the marketing needs to be very like normal person friendly and very kind of captivating and interesting and widely understandable. So makes sense to create good videos.
And I'd also say too, like you see like what's interesting in kind of DePIN specifically, I feel like in my mind there's really two categories that I care about in DePIN. It's which ones have the demand side that is focused on the user, and which ones have the demand side that is focused on enterprise. And of course, there's a little bit of a blurring between like enterprise and like end user looks like, but I think you can kind of tell which ones tend to focus on one versus the other. And like an excellent example of like this, where I don't know if we're leading in the space, but I'd say like once you start running New York subway ads, I tend to call that leading, right? That's like a good example of like what Helium did. That I think is just an example of like, of course, if you're, a consumer facing product, like running New York City subway ads is like kind of the best thing that you can really do in that type of scenario. So I'd say like, and there's, I think DePIN doesn't necessarily need to appeal to one versus the other. It's just really just a consequence of it. And I think we have to understand how we play to those strengths in either case. And so like, my friend, Guy Wallet also says like, from the deep inside of stuff that appeals towards more enterprises, you actually have to do enterprise sales, right? And so this kind of outreach for us is like our sales outreach, right? Where we're trying to appeal to consumers as much as we can. But then the kind of like savvy deep in protocols, at least that care about selling to enterprises, will have their own sales enterprise funnel as well.
Right. And there's also an interesting like enterprise versus consumer distinction on the supply side too, which we can get into later. But in terms of the marketing, in terms of the go to market and what you're trying to convince people to do. But yeah, before we jump into Dawn, maybe let's talk about the plumbing of the internet and how the internet gets from undersea cables that connect continents to data centers to rooftops to home routers to your mobile phone maybe. And then also how like Andrina and Dawn are involved in this whole ecosystem of the internet.
Yeah, so I'd love to explain this. So the internet, the way that I always explain it is the internet is broken up into three tiers, right? So tier one, think like subsea fiber optic cables that are on this, the sea floors essentially that are covered in sand, but with armored cables so that sharks can't bite through them, all sorts of stuff like that. And these are just cables that span continents, right? They actually, they also go up and down continents, for example. But these are kind of like the backbone of the internet, right? These are the guys that provide huge amounts of data between essentially the tier twos of the world, which is the second layer below, which is the data centers and the wholesale infrastructure. So when you think about like, the tier two of the internet, think like kind of these massive aggregation points where you have these like subsea fiber optic cable landings all the way down towards, the data center where they can tend to aggregate. And from there, you might have, regional fiber cables that actually interlink all of the data centers together. You can imagine if you're like how all of this stuff started from the finance days where people wanted to have connectivity close towards the exchanges. But then I think things then progressed outwards where once you have this wholesale infrastructure, that's really where the tier threes and the last mile come in. So the last mile of internet is the one that we're most familiar with, right? 4G, 5G internet, but also, broadband with, fiber and GPON connections and DOCSIS connections, right? Those are kind of the typical ways that we are familiar with internet. It's just how we access it. So people will typically call this kind of like the access layer of the internet, which is just how consumers end up connecting to it and accessing it. And the where Dawn comes in is our objective is to use wireless technology to take that tier three slash last mile of the internet and make it user powered. Because right now, the way it's mostly done all across the world is you have a centralized company that is owning the wires that go on the utility poles outside of your street, like I can see from my street over here, and those all feed back in towards the data center. And so the tier three is kind of like this bridge between the consumer and the wholesale, right? So they operate as that gap where they just own that infrastructure. And the reason that we've kind of got into this problem in the first place, and to restate the problem, is just the internet is just way too centralized, and that leads to like price gouging. You have a bunch of weird stuff that ends up happening. In the UK, for example, right? There's a lot of interesting stuff as of late about like how internet privacy and control is just being like constantly taken away from us. And so the idea of like this problem is ultimately stems from the fact that internet is just expensive, right? Is that if internet is cheaper to bring from point A to point B, then you wouldn't have this massive monopoly issue. And so what we see an opportunity of is to use wireless to make it cheaper to go from point A to point B, but then co-opt the consumer to help us build a network to ensure that the network can scale much faster and that it actually is user owned. And so I'm very much so imagine a world where every household, right, they're going to have, kind of like you'd imagine a future where every household has solar panels and they're responsible for their own generation of power. Every household is going to have just a small dish on their roof that allows it to participate in a trustless internet without even having to know it, without even having to rely on a last mile internet provider. It just participates in this seamless mesh that somehow connects you back to a data center without you having to be an expert. And that I think is the engineering challenge that we have to build towards. But what's fascinating is it doesn't even seem like it's that, in at least from my perspective, it doesn't seem like it's even that far sci-fi, right? There's a couple of like discrete engineering challenges you have to really solve to be able to do that. But it's that technology is already in play today. And that's what we've done at Andrina, our Web 2 company, where we've built an internet service provider that is providing internet to over 12,000 households now, across 10 different states. And so we've demonstrated that this wireless technology works at scale. And, now our objective is how do we take that technology, make it smaller, more accessible towards the consumer, and then allow them to get involved so they can get access to cheaper, better, faster internet that is also powered by the users themselves and who it's ultimately accountable to.
Yeah, and in terms of hardware and software, we'll talk about the black box a lot later, which I'm excited to get into. But I do believe you guys have developed some other kind of proprietary hardware software around maybe like that antenna you were talking about, like the robotic antenna system. So maybe tell us a bit about what that does, why it's kind of differentiated, or what kind of is the technical unlock there that allows you to beam gigabit wireless connectivity from a data center to like the top of an apartment building or the top of a home or something like that.
Yeah, so the real unlock for wireless, and if we kind of can consider this category of wireless, people in the industry will call it fixed wireless access, so FWA. So the real unlock for FWA really stemmed from the rural environment. So if you consider like back in like early 2000s, like even to late 2000s, right? Companies like Rise Broadband kind of pioneered this idea of like, hey, we're just going to go rent space on top of a big TV transmitting tower and then broadcast signals further away, and then just go do installations all across where you have a dish that receives it. And it's very much so identical to like dish TV, right? The way that and if you didn't have access to cable internet, you could actually get cable over the air. And so it's in this scenario where these areas were just had really expensive costs to build out internet. And so all of these kind of like a bunch of early pioneers from the fixed wireless space, like the most common one is this company called Ubiquity. They built all of this wireless technology and they just kept pushing the needle more and more and more about getting it cheaper, faster, so that you could actually do gigabit internet over the air. And the biggest unlock that we leverage at Dawn, which is, we didn't create this. This is like we're standing on the shoulders of giants to be able to leverage this, but is really this category of point to multi-point wireless. And the idea of point to multi-point wireless is you want to be able to have one node that can broadcast to many people. And that technology to be able to operate in the gigabit landscape really didn't start existing until around 2023 in early development and then 2024. And now in kind of 2025, we're in full swing, at least in the US, where this technology can really operate in a multi-gigabit fashion. And so now that you have one node that can broadcast to many, you kind of have the base level building block that you need to be able to build a people powered internet. And so all of the innovations that we do from there on out are to make it easy for people to work with that technology. And so a good example of like one of the things that you mentioned that we built is this robotic antenna system. And that's a way in which these antennas can automatically align themselves to point at that signal source. And that's kind of like one of the challenges that I mentioned early is that if you imagine a world where everybody's got a little transmitter that kind of forms this mesh and blankets the last mile, and somehow it connects one node back to a data center so all the data can flow that way. In order to do that, you need to be able to make it seamless, like I mentioned. But one of the constraints that you have is that you can't do this with omnidirectional antennas. You can't just have one antenna that broadcasts in a 360-degree pattern. The constraint to have it be multi-gigabit is you need to broadcast in a very narrow pattern. And the way that you kind of do that narrow pattern to shoot to different endpoints is typically a category called beamforming. So the way that we have approached it is we have tried to do mechanical beamforming, which essentially allows these antennas to automatically align themselves so they can aim to form that high capacity connection. So, it might be possible in the next several years where all this technology can really scale with omnidirectional. But now that we kind of have the base level building blocks that are there without omnidirectionals, we don't want to wait. We want to make it so that anybody can get involved super easy and get up and running. And, that's just like one category of the technology that we've built. We've also built our own wireless access points, for example, just because, companies like MediaTek make it so easy to get into the game and start providing like very, very cheap access points. And the use case for that is if you have like an antenna on top of apartment building, a brownstone, even a single family home, you needed to then propagate that signal towards, yourself or your neighbors, like whoever else. And that's really where kind of these cheaper wireless access points come into play because then you can kind of blanket these areas within only like a football fields of a radius to be able to service connection there. So I think we have really focused on like technology that leverages that point to multi-point antenna, makes it easy so that anybody can use that point to multi-point antenna, and then we build the hardware and software that goes downstream from that so consumers can kind of expand their own networks and beyond within their own backyards.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And I think you mentioned it briefly before, but there's this company Andrina, which is kind of how this all got started, which is a very successful ISP. So you've got a lot of kind of wireless background and experience. How will Andrina interact with the Dawn protocol? And maybe what does that look like in terms of kickstarting the network in terms of supply and demand? Because you've already got this successful, profitable ISP that's built on a lot of this underlying technology.
Yeah, so Andrina is an example of like an operator in the system, right? That's the way to think about it is that, Andrina is the labs company for Dawn, but then we're also just an early operator on the system just as an internet service provider. So all of our edge infrastructure, we're actually going to be moving that onto the Dawn ecosystem and capturing all of our revenue on chain, just as we would pitch any other provider as part of our enterprise sales for Dawn, right? And the idea is that we get we, like every other provider, gets the benefit of coverage rewards, but then also actually being able to build a trustless internet, which also makes it easier for us to scale. And the idea is that if we can kind of deploy our infrastructure infrastructure on chain, make it transparent, we don't actually have to worry about every incremental activation. It actually follows a self-install process. So like our network at Andrina, like just ourselves, like we provide coverage in the New York area to over 3.6 million households, I think is what our coverage map is there. We have more as part of the Dawn ecosystem, but that's just the Andrina network in the New York area, 3.6 million households. And so with that, with all that infrastructure on Dawn, anybody in that area can do a self-install process to get up and running, which just allows us to scale. So the value prop towards ISPs is just how can you get rewards for providing coverage, and how can you get massive amounts of scale without having to actually onboard individual customers yourselves? And so when you kind of view the power of crypto to really be able to bring people together around those 2 points, you can see how it just helps telecom activity scale. And the part that I'm always interested in is like, what does it mean to have a trustless internet where you can't lie about connectivity and all that kind of stuff? And so I imagine that with these incentives, with this trustless scalable nature of it, I can see a world where all last mile activity will eventually be on chain in the future. And I think the Dawn protocol is just a mechanism by which that will happen. But I think it requires some real technology changes that we haven't seen to date, because the existing internet infrastructure, ever since, TCP/IP was built in the 70s, or really brought to life in the 70s, we've lived in a world where trust was just a core piece of the internet. And I think now, because wireless allows anybody to participate, we're having to answer this question of how do you build a trustless internet? And that is really kind of where Dawn comes in, is, we take the OSI model and bolt on a trustless layer on top of it so that anybody can participate without having to trust each other. So to the whole conversation about, what Andrina is that we can just get to leverage that. We get to leverage that entire stack that just makes it cheaper and faster for us to scale.
Yeah, it's like can't be evil versus don't be evil, but for wireless
Well
internet
said.
provision.
Well
So,
said.
no, that's awesome. And so let's talk about the black box now. That's the first and latest kind of piece of hardware you guys have put out. It's super cool. We're doing a video about it now, but what was the motivation behind building that as your first product with Dawn, and how do you see it benefiting the people that purchase it?
So the motivation of it was actually twofold. One is a serendipitous intersection of technology, and number two was out of my personal frustration. So yeah, I appreciate you pulling this up. But this is like, so this box was essentially, we wanted to put out our first node, and we wanted to put out a node that ended up providing the most value for the user, just as a function of dollars in. And that was kind of like the business motivation for it. The like technology motivation behind it was that all of our workloads, like you can see over here, one of the things that we mentioned over here is that this is actually, we actually don't have, oh, we have it down there in the core architecture. So the routing platform that we actually chose was this thing called VPP, which stands for Vector Packet Processing. If anybody's familiar with like Terragraph, for example, like that's also part of the core innovation that Terragraph did to make routing and really dynamic and performant in their wireless radios. But we built this routing platform that is essentially built off of an open source platform, right? We didn't want to get vendor locked into like Cisco or Juniper, all that kind of stuff. So we ended up taking open source technology that was actually open sourced by Cisco themselves and building the ultimate routing platform. And the nature of that was that it actually ran on commoditized hardware, right? You wouldn't have to run it on a specialized router or a specialized switch. You could run it on just a generic x86 machine or a computer. And so when you could kind of build technology that is truly portable, that can just kind of run in most consumer devices, you start thinking about like, oh, what can I bolt on top of that, right? Can I add my Radius server, right? Can I add, a wireless access point that's virtualized? And you start to see all of this opportunity to bolt on different portable bits of technology into one form factor. And that was really kind of the dream for all of this. Is like, hey, we already have this box that's virtualizing all of these workloads. What if we actually had this operating as a Helium node or as an Arcium node or as an inference node? And that way we can earn additional rewards just for deploying this router, which we need to deploy anyway. So it was kind of this excellent overlap between the two of these things together, that I think kind of drove us towards being able to be really excited about building this. So it was, if I can kind of recap a little bit of that ramble, number one is we wanted to put out a Dawn node. Two, the routing technology we had allowed us to virtualize a lot of stuff. And so we started thinking, hey, how can we bolt on more stuff on top of it? And now I guess we can talk about the third reason for the black box, which is kind of like my selfish reason for it. The selfish reason that I had for this, for wanting to deploy the black box, is this is something that I wanted to build for myself, my friends, my family for a very long time. And the reason is because I'm like, oftentimes I feel like I have, like, a lot of antagonism towards cloud services. Like, oftentimes, they're just doing stupid stuff. Like, I feel like even, like, a VPN, for example, like, that's not really that complicated of a thing to be doing, and the margin that these guys extract, whether it's, like, VPN storage, is just insane. But we have the power to be able to host these services ourselves, and that is kind of the key thing that I've really wanted to build here, is I wanted to give people a way to break free from the cloud companies. And the black box is just an opportunity to do all of this in one, which is what got me really excited to be able to build it, right? Like, I'm in a scenario where I spend like over $120 per month in just like random cloud subscriptions. But if I can start taking care of my own streaming, my own AI inference, my own, photo storage, my own password manager, all this kind of stuff, then I'm in a scenario where I can just save money that I would be spending on cloud services, but actually own that infrastructure myself. And I remember like one of the key things that got me like super irritated about this whole journey was when I first got like a Ring doorbell, because I live like two floors up of a walk up, and I was like, oh, maybe if I can just like see who's in my front door to let my guests in and all that kind of stuff would make my life easier. But then I got a Ring, and I eventually found, I'm like, oh, Ring, by the way, they give police department like an access directly towards that without requiring a warrant. And that's when I'm like, dude, this is like such an invasion of my privacy. I get if you have a warrant for this sort of stuff, but like without a warrant, like we got an issue here. And so that's what like part of the impetus for when I just wanted to break free from this. And so as you kind of like combine all of these different trends, right? You think about like the self-hosted community, which is building all of their own miniature black boxes themselves on like the self-hosted subreddit, which like I love to browse on that one. Then you also have the crypto community, which believes in a lot of this kind of same premise of like taking back control of the internet and owning all of that. And then you have the idea that we need to put out a Dawn node anyway that has all of these virtualized workloads. It was kind of this nice serendipitous intersection of all of those things that allows us to really, I think, put forward a clear vision of what the future of the internet is going to look like, which this box demonstrates, which is hyperconverged infrastructure. I think the future of the internet is going to be one box that can seamlessly participate in almost every single function that the internet has. And I think it's just because the rewards are so strong if you can do something like that. All of these devices, whether it's a router, a switch, a server, a storage cluster, a GPU cluster, they all have base components like a motherboard, a processor, a power supply. So if you can find a way to spread out those across many different initiatives, it's only a matter of time until stuff like this becomes more mainstream, just because the arbitrage opportunity is too good. And so we want to really help accelerate that and bring that to individual households and allow them to realize real value the same way that I'm trying to do for myself in my own household.
Yeah, necessity is the mother of invention, so I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, another thing I think I wanna dive deeper on here is because you've got all this storage and compute and kind of bandwidth at the edge in someone's home, you can also do a lot of cool things around contributing to other deepened protocols and earning, rewards for doing so. So maybe, you've had a bunch of great partner announcements that have come out with the launch. Like, what are a few you wanna highlight in terms of use cases or deepins that customers of the black box can get involved with from day one?
Yeah, so when we were picking, we wanted to get the best of the best in terms of black box partners. And part of our selection criteria was kind of like how a venture capitalist picks these companies, where we want to look for like talented founders that like have a clear, interesting vision for the space. But then I would say the part that we've also added towards that is I wanted to incorporate technologies that I felt were like inevitable. And what I mean by inevitable is if you imagine an internet of the future, right? Like believe for a second that an internet of the future is possible where we own all of it, where rather than all this infrastructure being located at data centers, it's in our households. It's cheaper. We're able to earn rewards for all participating in this. Imagine that that's possible. Which of these protocols is it really, if they were to disappear, somebody would take their place as a leader in that space. And that I think was kind of the inevitability claim that we looked for, is like which ones were we convinced have to exist in this internet of the future. And so like obviously I think helium is like such a solid example of one of those, where like the idea of being able to aggregate Wi-Fi based carrier offload is just kind of like an inevitability, right? Like Wi-Fi chipsets are so cheap compared to LTE and 5G chipsets that it's only like it has to be done, right? Like it's too much of a good cost savings in terms of building infrastructure not to have something like that. Where if it wasn't helium, somebody else would be leading that space. So like that's like an obvious one, for example. But then the other cool one is we just did a Twitter Spaces on it earlier this week is like Arcium. Like Arcium, like I love what they're doing, where they're essentially doing decentralized multi-party compute so that people can do operations on encrypted data sets. And they make that easy for developers, right? So the idea is like if Connor and I wanted to compete about, who could bench press more or whatever that is, we could essentially sign, our one rep PRs, and then, this operation could compare those and see which is bigger without actually revealing what that underlying data set is. And I think like in if we consider like the internet of the future, that's one that I think is quite exciting is a world where people can participate in the internet without having to share their data because we can perform encrypted operations on encrypted data sets. And that technology, like fully homomorphic encryption, is more or less here. But the downsides that we have is that those require a lot of computation. And so now that we can provide this kind of like prosumer slash data center box in people's homes, all of these nodes can now participate in Arcium's network to help making sure that your data stays private and you're participating in a world where your data never leaves your home, but you can still participate in meaningful ways. And so like you can imagine scenarios like, finance is obviously one of those things, but like you can start doing credit checks without actually having to reveal any of your data, which I think is pretty interesting. So I think like that one is obviously super it's fascinating to me just because I love the cryptography side of stuff. But then the other piece too that I think is like a no-brainer is like all of the inference layers. And so, inference.net run by Sam, I think is like an incredible example of like a decentralized inference layer that is just like leading the charge in terms of how it combines this decentralized inference with custom training on top of it. And so I think like I look at AI as like a huge opportunity for value creation across all industries, right? And we've seen that happen especially in AI companies themselves. But I want to provide a way in which consumers can actually participate in all of that, and I think so do all of these AI protocols as well. What we want to provide is a tangible pathway by which that can actually happen. And there's a lot of interesting nuances on that one, but I think the idea that AI can be controlled by households rather than kind of like giant corporations, I think is a little bit more reassuring for a dystopian future. I don't know, Connor, if you had the chance to read AI 2027,
I
but
did.
that shit's scary, man. So I
It's
mean, I know
very.
it has a lot of assumptions in it, but like when you see that that's like a real it's not hard to imagine how that's a possibility for the future. And so anything that kind of rose against that, like, I'm always a fan for.
Yeah, I mean, I forget what it's called, the race ending or the speed ending. Like, it just calls to mind like the mutually assured destruction of kind of nuclear energy, nuclear weapons, and nuclear weapons specifically. Like in terms of the game theory between nation states, like the race to develop AGI is just on. And the thing is, like, if you slow down too much in terms of safety reasons, like your competitor country might just say, forget it and go full bore ahead. And if they develop AGI before you, then they win. It also can lead to the end of the world, but I guess we'll have to see how it all plays out. What does the go to market look like for you guys on selling the black box, getting it into people's homes? It's obviously both like a utility to the purchaser, but also like a node in the Dawn network. So it's kind of like honestly supply and demand side in one box, which is pretty amazing. But like, yeah, what's the early traction been like since you've been selling them? And then what's the go to market look like for the future? And is the end goal to get one in every single household in America and beyond, or what's kind of like the end goal there?
Yeah, so I mean, the traction been great. So it's a lot of work for us to do on the back end now with all of the CMs, but it's a good thing for us to be able to be able to focus on. So I'm glad to be able to do that, and I'm excited just to be able to like talk with the folks in the community and see what they really care about, but then kind of start to incorporate the second wave of protocols. Like we announced 10 protocols that we're partnering with. We're already working on the next 10. So it's cool to just see all the interest that we've got from our users and beyond and understand which protocols really mean a lot to them to be able to incorporate across the network. And to your point, the end vision here is like I want every single router in the world to have this functionality. And it's kind of one where I also view it as a little bit of inevitability because, if you know anything about like the architecture of your router, right? It originally started off with like this dumb MIPS device that has slowly gotten upgraded towards an ARM machine. Right now, most devices are running an ARM processor, and as ARM starts to become more and more performant, and then Intel also starts to participate more in that market as well, it's not hard to imagine where every single router in your future is going to be like a miniature N100 or on an Intel processor, for example. So, or now an Intel N150. But the point stands is like the router is getting stronger and stronger over time. And I would like to think if we're in a scenario where we're forced to upgrade that router over time, why not build the idealized version of it? And then so our go to market is actually a combination of a getting folks in crypto excited by this by allowing them to participate seamlessly in all of the crypto protocols that they like and want to earn rewards for. It's allowing our users to be able to contribute to the network, but then also we're going to be using various features in the black box to support the Dawn network, right? Like we're going to be using storage, we're going to be using inference operations. So it's actually pretty awesome that like part of our revenue that is going into the protocol is then being used to support our community even further by rewarding them for hey, you're storing all of our wireless telemetry data for us, and now you're going to be getting rewarded for that. Or hey, you guys, all of our black box users are running GPUs that can perform inference operations to help optimize our wireless network. Like it's just awesome to be able to kind of like use our consumers to build the supply for our own network for all the stuff that's secondary towards the network. So there's something kind of I view nice about that where like we're just using our users for the back end and they get rewarded for that, which is like not the core part of what Dawn is, but it's still a necessary piece of it. So I'd say, the crypto piece and the self-hosted piece is what we appeal to. But then to the other point about like, I want every router in the world to have this is, I very much so imagine a world where every router will have some level of virtualized functionality like this. And we want to create the gold standard by which that's the case. So I'm looking forward to open sourcing all the stuff that we've done in the black box so that people can in the future build their own. I think it's going to be quite an interesting time where you can just make this technology accessible to consumers.
Right. And there's been rumors of a token sometime in the future. So I'm curious if you can comment on any of that in terms of timeline. I mean, maybe one thing you can comment on, if not that, is like seems like you guys are aligned, Solana aligned, or looking to build in the Solana ecosystem. So yeah, anything you can share about token, anything on timeline, and then also just like, why'd you choose to make Solana your home in terms of where to build the project?
Yeah, I can't comment as everybody has tried to get me to comment on it over the past several months. But I can say that, it is on the top of our mind in terms of timing and all of that kind of stuff. So something that we are very keenly aware of, obviously. And then it will be launching on Solana. So it's kind of the two most concrete things I can share at the moment. And the Solana pick was an easy one. Like I didn't have to worry about managing additional infrastructure. I wanted to have a seamless way to be able to do it. Like Rust is just, I think, a better programming environment for this sort of stuff. And then on top of that too is just Solana is just the home for DePIN. So in my mind, if you want to have a solid community, like the early release that we've had from the black box has been so strong in large part thanks to the Solana ecosystem. So in my mind, it just reinforces that we made the right decision because that's just where all of the great DePIN community is.
Right. And yeah, you've been in DeepIn since the early days, honestly. Maybe first as like a deployer, right? And now you have your own DeepIn protocol. So maybe what have you learned going from kind of like a spectator deployer to becoming a DeepIn founder yourself over the last, it's probably at least 3 or 4 years now.
Yeah, and that's one I think I don't know. I'd imagine a lot of DePIN founders kind of have that in similar scenarios, but I think we're a little bit unique in the sense that we operated all right. Like we deployed DePIN infrastructure. I think at the time it was on four different states doing that, and at one point we were the second largest Helium deployer, right? So we have a lot of experience doing that kind of stuff. And what I learned is the deployer mindset. It's funny. It's not a. I wouldn't say it's really a learning. It's more like a reinforcement of the prioritization. Is that your deployers are everything, right? And so like as I'm building right now, I'm kind of building a scenario. It's like where what would have made my life easier, in 2020 and 2021 when I was building this stuff. What gets me more excited about building in that space beyond that? So I'd say the biggest thing I focused on is like how do you appeal towards your deployers and focus on building a product that's key for them, but then really blurs the lines between a consumer and a deployer themselves. So that's been kind of like the biggest learning lesson on just like the go to market and how to build the products out of stuff. There's a whole bunch of other learning lessons in terms of like tokenomics and all of that kind of stuff that would be its own podcast if we wanted to get into that and spend a lot of time on that. But the most important thing has been like, dude, just build a good product for your deployers. Like that's that's the most important learning lesson.
Yeah, and it seems like you've had some great kind of interactions and friendships and partnerships that have formed within the DePIN community. I mean, a lot of founders on Solana, but also just founders that haven't TGE'd yet, like Jason at Daylight and a few others. So what's that been like in terms of the founder journey and really forming some deep relationships with other DePIN founders? Like, how's that been kind of instrumental or important in your journey?
It's been instrumental because there's just people that are smarter than me, so it's just a good opportunity to be able to learn from them. Like Jason is like a good example of just somebody that just like he's leading in terms of how he thinks about tokenomics, and tokenomics is not my background. Like I have to learn it on the fly. And to be able to, like, work with people like him and just get his ideas and just incorporate them in my own worldview, it's like, I have an immense sense of gratitude and respect for folks that can really teach me some good stuff that way. But I'd say the biggest and most interesting thing is, like, all of the DePIN CEOs, they're all really cool people, and it's funny because they all kind of think like me. Like, it's weird where you meet people, so many people that you can kind of see a little bit of yourself in them, and it only comes down to how these people are trying to solve problems. And I think that's kind of what's so inspiring about DePIN is that the end state of DePIN, we all kind of agree towards that one way or another. Like you take the entire internet's infrastructure stack, everything from the OSI models to the virtualization side of stuff towards the hardware resource models, and you kind of fold that into one. And it's easy to see, at least from our perspective, a world where the consumer is powering all of it. They're powering all of it. They're getting all of they're getting the economic value that comes from powering this internet of the future. And so I think we all kind of believe in that one way or another. So the most reassuring thing is just meeting with people that believe what you believe and seeing the challenges that they tackle on their own to be able to solve those specific problems and being able to incorporate that into your worldview. Like every single DePIN CEO that I'm talking with right now is like super interested in just like how do you solve some of these problems that we've talked about before about making it easier for operators to scale. How do you find a way to message this to broader audiences? How do you find a way to make bulletproof tokenomics that do the underlying service justice? Right? There's a lot of these interesting challenges that nobody's really solved. And I am now fortunate enough to be in a situation where I have a lot of kindred spirits that we can actually push the industry forward to solving these problems together. And I'm mostly surprised that people haven't solved these problems before. So that's, I think, is kind of the biggest surprising thing. So it's just been an honor to be able to work with a lot of these guys.
100%. Yeah, it's a movement, it's a community. There's a lot of camaraderie and partnership and deeping, which has been great. Anything else you wanna cover or that we haven't hit yet today before we wrap?
So yeah, I think we covered a lot, man. We covered, a little bit about the internet supply chain, right? We talked about tier one, two, and three, how that works. We talked about the way tier three internet is typically done with wires. We talked about how there's a new way to do that with wireless, which we pioneered, or not pioneered, but have demonstrated at scale with Andrina. And now I think at Dawn, we're pioneering a way in which users can participate in all of that. And in the process of building that new user powered internet, we see an opportunity to have the router at the center of all of that, which is both powering the internet infrastructure itself to deliver broadband, but then the actual cloud of the future with AI, inference, all of that kind of stuff as the black box. So I think my biggest hope, if you're listening to this and you found this interesting, obviously reach out, ping me on Twitter, talk with me on Discord, all that kind of stuff. But I hope you can kind of see the through line between all the stuff that we've discussed here. So it's just been fun to talk to you, man, as always, or mostly me talking, but you know what I mean.
No worries, yeah, and buy a black box, don't forget, they're on sale right now. Neil, yeah, thanks very much for coming on, always a pleasure, and, we'll talk soon. Appreciate it.
Thank you, brother.